Hey everyone, welcome back to Daily Stand-Up. I have a book recommendation that I want to start out with for .NET developers, and it's called Microservices, Design Patterns in .NET. This is a book published by Packet, and if you've ever read Packet published books, it can kind of be a hit or miss depending on the content, but this one actually is really, really solid. I've actually read it before. I read it last year, and I plan to more or less skim through it again this year. I found that this one really presents the material in a way that actually can be followed along with and actually makes sense. And it touches on a lot of like system design issues and things that actually in a way that you can implement yourself. Like I found that the way it went about talking about using RabbitMQ, just as an example, API gateways, health checks, databases are really, really solid. The first, I would say, the first a couple chapters are more like conceptual in nature than anything. They're a little more high level, just talking about like domain-driven design, things like that. But once you get past the first two chapters and it really starts to get into like code, like I think it really makes a lot of sense. And I would suggest reading this, especially if you work with front end and back end and want to get into system design. I find that books are sometimes a hit or miss, especially when it comes to system design, because they're either like way too like niche of an area where it's like it's not really applicable, or they're like too high level where they don't provide any code and they kind of just talk about general problems that you may experience. This book is like kind of in the middle of that, and I found it to be really, really good. And again, I've read it before, read it last year, and I want to go through it again this year. So that's one recommendation. The second book, I shouldn't say it's a recommendation actually for this second book. It's just a book that I'm reading right now, and I'm going to hold my thoughts about it. It's called Practical Rust Projects. And it's not I shouldn't have said I'm recommending this, but this book brings up a lot of unique topics that Rust can be used for, and I happen to be learning Rust at the moment, and the section that I got to in the book was creating web APIs with Rust, and I didn't know you could do that, so now that kind of led me to look at Actix, basically a library for hosting servers with Rust. And the book goes into serverless. I think it uses AWS's Rust SDKs, AI, machine learning, just creating GUIs with Rust, and then just basically command line things. But I found that the book so far has done a pretty good job at just kind of giving you what you need at the time. And if you ever read programming books, you know that sometimes they almost give you too much code in a way that as soon as the book becomes outdated, a big block of the code in the book is now obsolete. And I find it hard to find programming books that stay relevant in the sense that you can more or less take the code and apply it to your program without too much, rework due to versioning of packages and everything like that. I would say back to the Packet publishers. Packet, I would say that it's a 50-50 with books. You really got to do your research, I think, on which book you are looking at. I've had the most success by far with Manning publishers for software development books. Manning just seems to consistently have very, very high quality books. They're usually pretty long. Manning usually hovers around the 400 to 500 page book, which is a sizable book. But I've read their dependency injection book, I've read their concurrency in .NET book, and I'm reading currently one of their Rust books. And I think I have planned, I'd like to read, there was one, it was like geometry for programming, where it talked about uses of like geometry and how that applies to programming. I don't know, it sounded like a really, really neat topic. So the Manning has a really long list, but they always seem very high quality. I think there was one. Am I forgetting one? I don't think so. But concurrency in .NET I've marked up a ton. But anyway, so back to Rust specifically. This is more or less the tutorial that you can look at on Actix website. Just kind of outlining how to get started generally with setting up a web API. And you can see it hosted there, right? This is calling hello world. If I give it a new route, hey, hey there. So just generally, I just literally followed this along. So if you want to follow along with me, you can. But it's real neat. Again, it's not that I'm wanting to necessarily make a web API with Rust. I'd probably still opt for using .NET just because that's what I'm most familiar with, and I think it's fast and it solves a lot of the same problems. But just learning it in Rust and wrapping my head around this new way of doing it, it's really neat. I think I learn a lot by doing it. So my goal, just because I'm curious about Rust and using it as a web API alternative to .NET, potentially I might explore incorporating it into my engines project. I might expose an endpoint perhaps that will allow me to maybe query the number of overheat messages that my Rust application has sent. Because since Rust is the one processing that data, it might make sense for Rust to store that data in application and also be responsible for querying that data, as opposed to .NET trying to access data that Rust publishes. Just maybe hold that responsibility in a Rust microservice. So that might be an option. Just that way, like that, the Rust microservice is responsible for all of its data, as well as making people aware of the data by way of endpoints and things like that. So that's the one use case I can extract from this maybe, and of course if I do it, I'll make content about it. But it's really neat because as soon as you learn like new stuff, and this is what really where it kind of gets exciting. Like as soon as you learn new languages and new ways of using the language, you can see, how you can fit it into projects and things like that, and it just kind of helps you expand. Like, okay, like, oh, now I know how to do this with that language, and I can incorporate it in this way and everything. Now, the downside of that is it creates more upkeep and more things to know and everything like that, and it kind of becomes, a jumbled mess in your mind. So then you have to document it, and then it's like, okay, well, if it's not documented clearly, then it becomes a mess. So it's like when you learn one thing, it creates like a web of other complex things you have to keep track of. But that's kind of sums up software development in my opinion. But yeah, anyway, so this is real basic, but again, this is the Rust code, right? It's literally just the tutorial code. So, but again, I just wanted to generally say that I got this running with no errors. And if you've been following along with the project at all, this is the Rust file that I have connected to my RabbitMQ server that reads and publishes messages from the queue. So this is like my first true exposure to writing a Rust microservice. So on the other side, writing an API it seems to make sense for the next logical thing to learn in this language. To be honest, there's a section in the book about creating, GUIs, with Rust, graphical user interfaces. I'm not all that interested in doing that, to be honest. And I'm also not that interested in making a command line program. They're not very fun to make. Like, they're kind of boring. And so I just don't really want to waste my time making an interface with Rust. I don't really want to. I'll be honest, I'd rather do that in Python more than anything. But I'm not big on making GUIs, just standalone GUI applications. They're kind of a pain. If you ever wrote them, they're fun at first, but then they just become like, I don't know, they just become a pain. Like web-based stuff is so much nicer to work with, in my opinion. Now I might be biased just because I'm more like I'm more versed in web development rather than like native applications. So, but yeah. But as far as the YouTube thing goes, I should have a change coming to the channel. Hopefully, that will significantly improve the audio. So be on the lookout for that. Probably tomorrow, to be honest. Um, and yeah, so that's honestly that's about it. And I have to look. I'm trying to find an application, a better like streaming application. That way, I don't have to create a screen recording as well as like a movie recording, and then overlay the two and then stitch them back together. So if anyone has any suggestions, let me know. I've used like OBS Studio before on Windows. I don't know what the best solution is on Mac. So yeah, we'll get there. But yeah, that's all the programming content I have this time. So yeah, I'll see you in the next one.